Welcome, everybody. So I will do the opening remarks today because unfortunately our secretary from the ENG is unable to be with us today. I apologize, I'm still also doing administrative matters. So 2020 was intended to be groundbreaking for gender equality. We're marking the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. But instead, COVID-19 pandemic has had disproportionate impacts on women and risks rolling back the gains in recent decades and steepening the pre-existing inequalities. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the 2050 Vision for Biodiversity of Living in Harmony with Nature commits to leaving no one behind, therefore necessitating that gender mainstreaming as set out in the SDGs is reflected and advanced in the efforts by member states and stakeholders to halt biodiversity loss. So especially the UN Secretary General has highlighted the need to focus on people and the most vulnerable in particular. He emphasized specifically women and girls should be put at the center of efforts to recover from COVID-19. And that's partly why we're here today. We have the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the new Gender Plan of Action for the post-2020 period. And this provides a timely and relevant foundation to ensure a comprehensive approach to address gender issues within the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and the sharing of its benefits. So we're here to build on the UN Secretary General's call to action on human rights. The promotion and protection of human rights of women in all spheres of work must be understood as foundational to the values and goals of the UN, not as a simple add-on. And we're going to be focusing on the gaps, opportunities, and next steps for collaboration and synergies and implementation of a new gender plan of action for biodiversity. And so we intend to convene and engage the UN system behind rights-based environmental action with a focus on addressing issues of gender equality in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And so we welcome you all today to today's Nexus Dialogue, and thank you very much for our esteemed colleagues for your expert perspectives. So now we'll give it back to Soo-Young.
Thank you, Nina, and hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, from wherever you're joining. Thank you for joining us today. So my name is Soo-Young Hwang. I'm a legal officer with the Law Division in UNEP, and I'm very happy to be here to give a few words on in the beginning and also moderate the workshop. So first of all, so what is a UNEP doing on gender responsiveness and biodiversity? So I can tell you a little bit. So the executive director of UNEP, so Inga Anderson, when she was transiting from IUCN to UNEP at the last UNEP 4, she actually pointed out there are three major gaps in biodiversity efforts. And one is actually like lacking of gender integration. So with her leadership and also the thematic priorities of UNEP, which three thematic priorities of UNEP, one is climate change, pollution, as well as biodiversity. So we're trying to integrate gender responsiveness in all our work, not just limited to the one division. So that's what we are really trying to do at the UNEP. And questions about how can we address this biodiversity and the gender responsiveness or gender integration is one, I think, is taking a rights-based approach. As you can all agree that it's the rights-based approach makes the environmental laws and policies more effective and more implementable and also more legitimate and sustainable. And also like rights is not just it's also process, but also as an outcome to improve lives of women and girls. And also it makes, we serve for our constituencies, the planet and also the people on the planet. And second is focusing on the vulnerable groups. And I'm not saying women and girls are vulnerable, but they are made vulnerable because of various reasons, socioeconomic reasons and other factors. So what's really important is to identify them, not the vulnerable, what makes them vulnerable, and also to make sure that make the systemic changes in the law and in the policies and also in the practice in our biodiversity efforts. And also that will also help achieving SDGs to leave no one behind, as Nina mentioned in the beginning. And 3 will be finding good opportunities and entry points. And I think this is a really timely and good meeting so that we can discuss about how we can enter into these negotiations that is ongoing and it will be taking place very soon, such as post-2020 biodiversity framework, and also the new gender plan of action. And also there are a lot going on at the Human Rights Council. They just adopted a resolution on biodiversity about 2 weeks ago, which has a specific focus on gender integration. And also there's ongoing discussion about the right to healthy environment at the council. And lastly, the ways of improving and ways of integrating gender in biodiversity is a coordination and also working together and the multi-stakeholder consultation like this. So I cannot agree more that this is a really, really good meeting and then we should actually continue beyond this meeting and planning and also the implementing this biodiversity issues and the gender integration. So I will leave it there. And I thank the EMG Secretariat and also CBD Secretariat for organizing this meeting and all of you for participating in this meeting. Looking forward to the active discussion later on. Thank you. And I will give the floor to Tanya to give a presentation on the GPOA. Over to you, Tanya.
Thanks very much, Soo-Young, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. It's great to see so many of you. I hope we can pick up on the interesting discussion that we had yesterday to hear from more of you on your views and the types of actions that you think should and can be taken in support of gender responsive approaches for biodiversity and other environmental concerns. I'll just give a brief overview of where we are so far in the process to develop a new gender plan of action for the CBD for the post-2020 period. And some of you may be more familiar with this than others. But the process began this past summer, somewhat as an opportunity that was brought on by the pandemic, which has resulted in delays to the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which has given us more time to prepare a plan in line with the framework. A first draft outline was made available for consultation to parties and stakeholders in August of this past year, and a second consultation was just closed on an updated draft outline. And so that just closed last week. And what has been put forward to date is an outline. And the purpose of this is to obtain inputs and seek agreement on the structure of a plan and the key objectives and related elements, with the idea that more specific details could be proposed for consideration as the plan is further developed. And as I mentioned yesterday in the discussion, the plan is intended to take a different approach from the previous versions under the CBD, in that this would include key priorities or results areas. They're currently referred to as goals in this last version of the draft outline. These are linked to objectives and measurable actions that, to the extent possible, would include appropriate indicators to enable parties and other actors under the CBD to better measure progress towards 2030. The other approach of this plan, which differs from those in the past, is that this plan is intended to serve as a means to support gender responsive implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The updated draft outline that is currently available online explicitly includes linkages to different goals and targets of the updated zero draft of the post-2020 framework. And the aim in referencing specific goals and targets is not to indicate that the gender priorities and actions proposed are only relevant for those particular parts of the Global Biodiversity Framework, but to highlight the areas in which linkages are most directly relevant, in order to put a focus on the gender objectives and actions to be addressed in the setting of national targets and associated activities in MBSAPs, which are the principal instrument that will guide efforts to implement the post-2020 framework. To talk more specifically about what is included in the draft outline of the plan, it puts forward a set of guiding principles that outline the importance of things like targeted action to address the needs and priorities of Indigenous and rural women and girls. And it attempts to make clear that the references to women and girls in the plan are inclusive of women and girls in all of their diversity of age, ethnicity, race, and other factors of difference. And the principles also highlight the purpose of the plan to complement and support the implementation of the SDGs in line with the biodiversity agenda, and to maximize synergies with gender responsive approaches to address other related environmental concerns, notably climate change and land degradation. So as I mentioned yesterday, and as was discussed by the other panelists as well, the draft outline puts forward 3 priorities or results areas currently labeled as goals. So these are, again, for women and girls to have equal access to ownership and control in regards to biodiversity and ecosystem services, that women and girls would benefit equally from nature and biodiversity, and that biodiversity policy planning and programming decisions address equally the perspectives, interests, and needs of women and girls. So just to speak a little bit more to the different objectives related to these results areas or priorities, in regards to equal access, ownership, and control regarding biodiversity and ecosystem services, the objectives put forward for consideration in this draft outline include increasing women's rights to land and biological resources, eliminating gender-based violence and access to and conservation of biodiversity, which includes reference to protecting women human rights defenders, ensuring mechanisms are in place to enable equal access for women to resources and services to support their conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. In terms of the second results or priority area, ensuring that women and girls benefit equally. This is proposed to look at objectives including ensuring mechanisms are in place to enable women and girls to have equal access to nature's benefits. And those benefits identified in the Global Biodiversity Framework, the draft framework, include things like nutrition, food security, livelihoods, health, and well-being, among others. And a second objective is the promotion of quality and paid formal employment opportunities for women and girls in biodiversity-related value chains or supply chains and sectors. And lastly, in ensuring the outcomes of biodiversity policy and programming decisions fully include women's perspectives and needs, the objectives identified include increasing and strengthening the participation and leadership of women at all levels of decision-making related to biodiversity, enhancing the full and effective and meaningful participation and leadership of women in processes under the convention, and integrating gender considerations into MBSAPs and their implementation, budgeting, and reporting. So the draft outline also includes a set of 4 implementation and review mechanisms, which address objectives associated with things like knowledge generation, management, and sharing, which includes strengthening the evidence base and the collection and analysis and use of sex disaggregated data, and to support reporting on gender actions. Partnerships and collaboration is another mechanism identified, and that's specifically with women's organizations, networks, and gender experts. And also ensuring monitoring and reporting and the allocation of resources for gender responsive implementation. The plan also includes some example actions and points to linkages with indicators identified under the Global Biodiversity Framework. This is meant to be a starting point for the identification of other relevant actions to be taken at the national level and for the identification of appropriate indicators for monitoring of the plan. So I would say, I think the plan has a lot of potential to support an ambitious agenda for biodiversity and gender in the coming decade. However, one area that we are falling short in somewhat to date is ensuring engagement by parties, and to a somewhat lesser extent by stakeholder groups in the process to develop the plan. For the first online consultation in August, we received 10 submissions from parties and 20 from stakeholder groups. For this second consultation, we have now received 11 submissions from parties and 10 from stakeholder groups. So I'm pointing that out to say that I think there is room for more participation, engagement, and inputs, which is what I hope we can also benefit from in this discussion today. So I encourage you all to share your views and to contribute to the conversation both in the next 2 hours and in the process under the CBD as we move towards the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and a new gender plan of action at COP15, which is to be held in October in China. The official dates have just recently been set for that. So I just want to bring that to your attention. I hope that was clear and not too rapid fire for those of you who are not as familiar with the plan. But I will hand it back to you, Soo-Young, now to take things forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tanya, for the very comprehensive overview. And Tanya, I just wondered if you have, do you have this draft outline and the documents available online? If possible, could you share it in the chat box?
Yeah, sure.
The link in the chat box will be, I think it was great. So thanks, Tanya, for also setting the tone for the upcoming discussions. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, new colleagues joining in. That's really great. I think we have over 25, almost like 30 participants. So let me just quickly go over the agenda of the day. So we have, the discussions will center on 4 questions that's been shared with you already. So Nina will show you each questions as we move on. So the 4 questions we have allocated 20 minutes for each question, and we're going to be able to accommodate about 7 interventions. And we'll really appreciate if you could keep your interventions up to 2 to 3 minutes, so that we give a chance, we give everybody a chance to speak. And then when you want to take the floor, could you use the chat box and just say your name, and I'll make a note, and we'll go by the order that's been set there, because we don't have a function to raise a hand on Zoom. So please use the chat box. And so after the 4 questions, we are going to, so if there are any remaining questions and you couldn't raise it during these 4 questions, feel free to raise that during the Q&A session. And after the Q&A session, Tanya will sum up the discussions, and then we'll give the floor back to Nina, who'll be giving the final remarks for this meeting. So without further ado, so shall we get started with the first question? So Nina, kindly put the question on the screen. So I could just read it out loud. So what lessons from the development and implementation to date or related commitments under the SDGs, UNFCCC and UNCCC gender action plans and other processes should be considered for the proposed CBD gender plan of action? So if you have any examples of the lessons that you've learned from your own processes or other related processes, please feel free to share with others and also take the floor. So I will give a few minutes for everyone to read through the question and think about the inputs and the feedback. Okay, so anyone feedback or reactions to the question? So I think it's always a first, being the first one is difficult, but we may give you extra minute for the first speaker.
I see Jillian here has typed her name. Please type your name in the chat box, but also address everybody so that they can all see your name. Thank you. Okay, I have Natalie. Natalie, over to you.
Hi, hello everyone. Yeah, I am not working as directly with the CBD, but I've been really engaged with the NDC process. And that's, we've been looking over, well, we've been doing a deep assessment of the NDCs and the policy framework around them within several countries. And what we're finding is that even with the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan and other commitments that these countries are making, that most of their policies that support those commitments do not align either with each other or with those commitments. gender is very minimally woven into the policies, such as, maybe the energy policy or the waste management policy that would be supporting the climate policy or supporting the NDCs. And the climate policy itself is also not aligned with the NDC and the commitments to gender in that. And so I think there's just a real struggle in the countries, and lack of coordination within the countries is what we're finding as we're trying to engage with all the different ministries to really understand how those commitments would play out in their policies and what changes need to be made within the policies, how to keep them aligned across each other so that they're supporting, you have this broader support, reinforcing all of the commitments that are in these higher level international agreements. So I think that kind of review and support to countries would help them to strengthen whatever commitments they're making at this UN level. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I forgot to mention, so when you take the floor, could you just say your name, also your affiliation? Sorry, I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, sorry. I'm Natalie Elwell. I lead the Gender and Social Equity program at World Resources Institute. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. And next I have Jillian Campbell. Jillian,
good morning. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Jillian Campbell, and I work at the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity with Tanya. I just wanted to highlight two different things. One is that when we're talking about the gender plan of action at the national level, and this is something that Tanya and I have talked about extensively, is that it can't sort of be a standalone activity. It needs to be part of the NBSAP umbrella, as she was mentioning, because even the NBSAP is a bit of a standalone activity, or has been underneath the convention. And so I think that one of the things that we really need to do is try to make sure that we're harmonizing the planning processes across these different conventions and across the SDGs in order to maximize our impact, and ensuring that gender is sort of integrated within this central planning process and isn't considered as a standalone issue, because if it is, it's going to have a very small audience. And so, I think that this is something we should be thinking through as we move forward. I also, on that same thing, is one of the proposals that we have underneath post-2020 GBF implementation right now is to increase the ability of non-state actors to generate commitments. And this would allow not only countries to be submitting their commitments in terms of what they're going to do for the global biodiversity framework, but it would also provide a way that women's groups and NGOs could submit commitments and feel more engaged in the review process, so that information would then be officially used to monitor under the convention. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight, I previously worked on the SDG indicators, and I do think that having a set of indicators in addition to the goals and targets that really capture gender is going to be essential, because what ended up happening in the SDGs, or my impression is, you have the targets, and then underneath the targets for the SDGs, you have the indicators. And the indicators do serve a function in terms of sort of further defining the target, so that the indicators themselves are where a lot of the work and financial resources are directed, is around the types of topics that show up in that indicator. And so I think that in the CBD, the same thing is likely to happen, since we will have an official monitoring framework for the global biodiversity framework. So it's really important that we make sure gender is integrated not only at the target level, but in the indicator level. Thanks.
Thank you, Jillian. And I have Floor Newman from UNEP. Over to you, Floor.
Hi, thank you, and good to be back today. I think just a couple of observations. One is that creating the spaces for peer-to-peer exchange on what's happening at a national level, even in COVID times, proved to be very useful. So last year, one of the Gender Action Plan activities under the UNFCCC was to host for the Secretariat to organise a day and a half workshop during the SBs, and the SBs didn't happen. So that was converted into 5 regional workshops. And we found that, in fact, being able to offer them regionally had its advantages. So not being in person has its disadvantages, but doing it virtually did mean that we reached a different audience than we would otherwise have done if we had only hosted the event in Bonn during the subsidiary body session. And normally we would expect to have 120 people at that kind of workshop. And we had over 500, 600 people joining those workshops. So one of the things that we've learned from that is that there's huge benefit in us being able to look beyond what we do at the international level to also do things regionally, but also that space that we created in order for parties to exchange not only with themselves, but also with organizations and women's associations and others who were supporting that work was appreciated, and it started the creation of also relationships between countries in the region. So I think one of the things about the alignment that Natalie was talking about is it was one of the areas that we actually focused on for those workshops, because policy alignment still remains a challenge for many countries and continues to be something that is worth revisiting and focusing on. So.
Thank you, Flor. It was really good that you also answered some of the issues that was raised by previous speaker. So now I have Manali, right, from CBD Women Caucus. Over to you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to being here. My name is Mrinalini Rai, and I've been engaging with the Convention on Biological Diversity for a couple of years now, and in particularly looking at the dimension of gender and the integration of a rights-based approach to a healthy environment in the GBF. I think from our perspective, like Tanya said, we have been engaging and giving submissions. We recently did an extensive submission on the Gender Plan of Action. So I'm happy to share both the versions of it to see what concrete actions and recommendations we have made to strengthen the GBF. And I'll just take out one of the key elements that we have proposed. One of them has been that the alignment of the Gender Plan of Action with the whole of the monitoring framework of the GBF. That's really very important to ensure that there is an equitable acknowledgement and implementation of the whole of the Gender Plan of the Global Biodiversity Framework, besides Target 20, which has specific reference to women and indigenous people and youth. Another element I think that we think could really work on is if all the 3 Rio Conventions and the SDGs, they do have some of the key elements like like Tanya pointed out on accountability, transparency, outreach, knowledge management, capacity building, and financing. And I think this is one of the key areas which is very important to address. And this could be streamlined or build a synergy between all the Rio Conventions and the other MEAs, like maybe having a joint communication or an outreach strategy. Another thing that I think is really very relevant is to ensure the implementation is the monitoring, review, and reporting. Like the CBD, the NBSAPs are there. You also have the same for the climate. So there is an alignment where certain indicators are reflected in all to address it. I think that could be one of the way forward. I won't go more in detail. I'll give the space for other colleagues to join in, and I'm happy to share some concrete recommendations in the hour ahead. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Manali. Like, it will be great if you could also share your inputs in the chat box. And now I have Veronica Coulantes from UN Women. Veronica, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning. Sorry, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yeah, we're all in different time zones. Thank you for this invitation to participate and contribute to this dialogue. Thank you to the EMG Secretariat for bringing all these actors together, especially in this very difficult period where we cannot have a face-to-face possibility of a face-to-face discussion, but I think it's very timely, and it's very interesting to hear the comments already made, and it's exactly the the points that we have also been thinking about in UN Women. I've been hearing about synergies and alignment. In our work, that has also been one of the things that have been sort of the issue that's raised by our participants to our workshops, that there's so much silos in the implementation of gender responsive commitments. And this brings me to a paper that UN Women is currently working on, which is basically on how to enforce or implement a more synergistic way of working. And it actually goes through we can think of the implementation as on the ground, but then we can also think of moving it a little bit higher. So parties to the convention, it can start from the parties to the convention. How can we encourage coordination and collaboration from that? And then even at the level of the Rio Convention secretariats, the gender action plans, how do the gender action plans of the convention secretariats speak to each other, for example, or any activities that can be done by the convention secretariats or other UN entities, even including capacity building, data, identification of indicators, gender responsive indicators that will cut through the three conventions. We can just think of meaningful participation, for example, as one, or access to benefits and benefit sharing. So I know that this is just a brush stroke, but just to mention that really the important part that I could think of in terms of a implementation systematically of a gender responsive the gender responsive implementation in the environment sphere is really through synergies and alignment at all of these different levels that I just mentioned. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verona. So we have a very, very good timekeeper. So Nina was saying that we will move on to the next question. So before I do that, let me just quickly say that I think there's a lot of good feedback came up. So like the issue with the policy alignment, and also like Flora shared an example from UNEP CCC workshop, and the marginalization of like gender program in certain areas, and the importance of doing integrating gender in the targets and also the indicators of the post-2020 framework, and also the importance of the strong monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and that the civic space, civil society engagement, so NGOs and others, or women and girls, to engage in the process, and also the importance of like creating synergies, as mentioned by Veronica last time. So with that, we'll move on to the question 2. So we'll have the same modality for the question 2. So Nina, kindly put the question on the screen. So have a look at the question, and so also take, just type in your name and your affiliation, and then we'll go by that order. Okay, we already have a volunteer. So I have Catherine Despot Balmont from UNEP WCMC. Catherine, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just building on some of the comments from Verona, UNEP WCMC and UN Women have been collaborating for the past couple of years, basically on raising awareness on the importance of addressing gender biodiversity data gaps. especially within the context of the CBD, and trying to build and enhancing synergies from the experiences from other conventions. So I think it is still important. Data collection and analysis, it is still a priority, because data will be essential for making women and girls' contributions towards a healthy environment visible. The importance of sex disaggregated data and making use of gender-specific indicators will be key for monitoring progress towards gender and biodiversity-related goals and targets. And data provides the evidence base to inform policy change. And there have been really successful examples from Costa Rica, Malawi, Mexico, where they made use of sex disaggregated data, especially from pilot projects that were used to inform policy change in favor of gender equality and women's empowerment. And also looking at the components on capacity building and resource mobilization will be now important. So women's time and expertise and contributions need resourcing. So it will be important to ensure that the relevant instruments, such as the long-term strategic framework for capacity development and the resource mobilization component of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, also include the relevant provisions that help to ensure the meaningful participation of women in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And UNEP WCMC will continue contributing in the process and supporting the Secretariat to integrate these inputs in the Gender Plan of Action. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. You were a little bit soft, but I think you mentioned about the importance of disaggregated data in the reporting, and also shared some examples from Costa Rica, and with the importance of resource mobilization and participation, I think. And thank you, Catherine. And I see, is there anyone else who wants to come in? And just to say, I think like this question 2 really focuses on what we did not expect will happen, which is COVID-19 last year or the year before. So just really trying to find out what should be the additional area of focus that we really need to work on. And if you have any examples, or if you have identified any focus areas in your work, so please share with us. Okay, I have, okay, Manali from CBD Women Caucus. Manali, you have the floor.
Sorry for taking the floor, I'm waiting. I'm happy to build up on this. And I think also complementing what Catherine said before, I think one of the key elements that is really very good to see reflected in the Gender Plan of Action, the new outline, is the importance of considering the environmental human rights defenders. I think this is really very relevant to all the work that is coming up. Not only it was before the COVID pandemic, but it has exacerbated that situation. And I think now with the post-2020 GBF, it's missing. So it would be really very good of how all of you experts and all these agencies really pushes that agenda to actually have it reflected in the GBF. Because if there are no indicators on environmental human rights defenders or human rights approach in the GBF monitoring framework, it will not be a priority for parties to take it on board in the Gender Plan of Action. This is also considering, like Tanya shared, there hasn't been many submissions that have been brought on by parties, 10 in the first rounds, 11 in the second round. So I think, and including this, this would be a very important element considering the extensive work of the CBD in the mainstreaming work that they are looking at into energy, mining, agriculture, and other sectors. So I think that would be very good to have it reflected much more visibly. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Manali. And I have next I have Georgiana Katakura Vargas from UCB. Georgiana, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to the Secretariat of the CBD for allowing me to be part of this workshop. I would like to build on 3 points that perhaps are not particularly going to the core of these questions, but are very important because they relate to context. And context, and to consider context, is very important when we are talking about different processes. Based on experiences from Latin America, I am from Bolivia, by the way, and some people know me from being the negotiator from Bolivia for a number of years, but now I am the academia doing research. And based on real cases happening last year in the COVID-19 pandemic scenario, what is happening with women, rural women, who are directly related to biodiversity management and also deal with the nexus between energy, food and water, is that they are more in disadvantage for realizing their rights for issues related to the context, such as the digital gap. Women have farmers, for instance, and people from rural areas and other vulnerable groups have less access to communication, and with that, long distance communication, and with that, less opportunities to participate in governance processes and decision makers that they have been also participating to build up. And that's a problem and has different connotations for women. I don't know, I don't have the answer how this could be reflected in the post-2020 or another processes, but it's something very important to take into account, because if those factors of the context are not put on the table, then it's going to be very difficult that women realize their rights and also are exercise and full and active participation in these processes. Second, very briefly, I do believe, based also we are carrying out a research documenting the role of women in biodiversity and climate change through ecosystem management in the Andean region, doing a literature review. And it is amazing that the literature has very important limitations in going beyond women's care roles. I do believe that for this full and active participation of women, is very important also to generate information on the effective roles of women have in a really broad spectrum going beyond care. And that relates to what another person said on the relevance of gathering information. Finally, I do believe what Tina said in her last intervention on also considering where women are, what is their role, and how different sectors like mining, agriculture, tourism, tourism I think is a very key sector, and others also is very relevant. How to put this in the GBF and other action plans and indicators and monitoring is still a challenge, but I fully agree that those are key aspects to work on to visualize and women's role and advance in implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgiana. That was very spot on answering all these questions, especially about the digital gap. I think that's something we sort of miss out sometimes, especially the access to the internet and everything, especially for women in rural areas. So that was a really good point, and also the good point about different sectors' approach to the GBF. And I will move on to the next speaker, and I don't see anyone yet. Anyone else would like to?
I raised my hand.
Oh, Jackie?
Yeah.
Jackie Stiles?
Yeah. Yeah, this is Jackie from IUCN. I think the pandemic has put women in a worse condition, and we know that COVID had exacerbated the vulnerability of women and also increased the women workload. And this makes women, especially rural women, more dependent of biodiversity resources. So I think we need to do an effort and to ensure that the access and the control of women over the resources that they depend on for their livelihoods is secure. And also, I think it's relevant because of the livelihoods and economic power of women linked to biodiversity resources, that it is important to strengthen the participation of women in value chains linked to biodiversity resources. And in addition, what it has been said about women rights defenders, I think it is important that they do their work not being threatened by gender-based violence, and that they can do it in a safe way, and that also they are builds some kind of solidarity process, so they can be also be secure. That's it.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for raising all the issues, especially on also with the women environmental defenders. And now I have Joni Seeger from Bentley University. Joni, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. Greetings to everyone. My comment, which is very kind of poorly formed at this point, but builds on what Georgina and Jackie have just said, which is to, in part, remind ourselves and bring focus on the fact that women were the first thrown overboard from paid opportunities, paid work, monetized opportunities through the pandemic. And I would predict that they'll be the last, they'll be behind most of their male counterparts coming back into resourced, monetized, paid opportunities and work. And I'm not sure where that leaves us in terms of thinking about biodiversity, or the development agenda, but certainly as things return, quote, to normal, and as resources perhaps flow into new sectors, I think we need to be very attentive to the fact that the unpaid labor of women is what has really brought everyone through this pandemic to the extent we've been brought through, and that special opportunities need to be provided as programs get monetized, as jobs get made, as the hopeful green new economy, blah blah, gets underway. There's nothing. We can't just assume that women will participate in that or be allowed to participate in that. So it's a kind of an ill-formed caution that's ringing in the back of my head about watching the monetary effects of this pandemic and the importance of women's unpaid labor. So I'll stop rambling there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joni, for pointing out very important aspect of unpaid labor of women. Can't agree more. So we'll move on to the next question with the Joni's intervention. So question 3. So the part 3. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't read the question. So as I trust that everybody can see the slides that Nina put on. So the part 3, question 3 is in developing a gender plan of action under the CBD that aligns closely with existing international commitments related to gender and the environment. This puts an emphasis on the importance of leveraging action at different scales and in different processes to enable larger scale change. So on this, if you have any inputs on the existing frameworks, existing processes, and what kind of leverages that we can use, and what has been successful, and what lessons we have learned, and also what is your agency's or your organization's mandate in mind in this regard. So please type in your name and sign up in the chat box, and we would appreciate your sharing your opinions on this question. I have Marlene Elias from Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. Marlene, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm not sure this really answers the question, but it's just a point that I thought was important to raise. Also building on what Verona mentioned the secretariats before. And I think it's really about also thinking about culture change within the secretariats and how much, you know, it's about mainstreaming and thinking about how gender can become the everyday business of people within the secretariats as well. So really thinking about that culture change within that can then radiate outwards as we work as you work with parties and so on. So I think that's an important piece, and I don't know whether or how it can be reflected in the gender plan of action, but certainly something to keep in mind in operationalizing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. And I have next in my list, Georgiana Katakura Vargas. Georgiana, over to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to answer directly. So what are some high impact leverage points? And something that I don't see it in this graph clearly. And once again, this comes from the analysis of ground experiences. And among women, as other actors, a very important leverage point is a territorial approach on what we are working, either biodiversity or climate change or water or whatever it is. And this is related to, in my view, and once again, the experiences that I am studying now, securing access to resources to women, particularly access to either land or access to the sea. This is very important at two levels. One, the very practical, tangible elements and processes for a transformative action, or even something even less big as securing livelihoods. But also it builds on those intangibles that are very important that will translate in attitudes and actions. I don't know if I am making clear myself. I'm sorry if I am being a bit confused, but what I'm trying to say is that the territorial approach that integrates different aspects, social, ecological, economic, cultural aspects of the territorial dynamic is a very important leverage point. And the second one related to it is securing access. In this case, I am focusing on land. Both develop a very strong feeling of ownership in different sectors, in this case, women, and that's a very strong motivation to do something different, and conserving, for instance, and applying a sustainable use of biodiversity. So I do believe it will be very important to discuss that. That's also related to some rights of women and peasants and all other actors. So I would like also to leave that on the table. Thanks.
Thank you, Georgina, for talking about the importance of the land tenure and the women's ownership. And so next I have Natalie Elwell from WRI. Natalie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So from a number of the points, I've been thinking about how these things roll out. And one thing I'm seeing that I think has a lot of implications for women to get beyond what was said about just focusing on the care role or women's basic needs. I think the language we use a lot of times is not understood by those that are actually implementing. And there's a lot of jargon like women's agency and things like that, that we might say is getting us beyond the basic needs and into leadership and empowerment. But I think even this term empowerment is not understood and how you get to that. And so what I see is that a lot of the organizations that implement around the CBD are biodiversity organizations. They focus on environmental outcomes, and we say co-benefits of these human well-being indicators, but they're not equal co's. And so the primary focus is on the environment, and the people implementing them are scientists, they're environmental experts. They don't necessarily have this strong basis in how you implement in a way that brings about empowerment. And we're dealing with really entrenched social dynamics in all of these spaces. And so it's really hard to get past, even with some kind of quota or donor impositions about social dynamics. It takes a long time. And I think we're not really set up to address some of those things. So we keep getting at maybe basic needs, but as we see from COVID, and we've been trying to work on empowerment for decades, we still are left with women suffering the most when it comes right down to it, because we haven't affected the underlying social changes that are needed to really bring about equality. And so I think some of that has to be built in, maybe through changes in our language and more explicit guidance on how do you get about that? What are the approaches that we're talking about there? So how can we really foster that enabling environment to bring about empowerment? And I think that some of it has to do with who's funded under the mechanisms that support these commitments. And I think that we need to focus a bit more on the organizations that have that kind of skill, where some of the environmental or building it up in the environmental organizations. So I think there's some changes there. And as far as commitments, WRI is committing to that. I think we've been on this journey ourselves of trying to bring about that change. And now we're starting to build it in, rather than one gender advisor, we're building it into all of our teams where there's that expertise, and we start to see that shift in the proposals or in our projects, and bringing the expertise at a national level into those projects. So they're not so focused just on the environmental outcomes, but that we do really get at co-benefits as equal co-benefits. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalie. I cannot agree more about actually that you're speaking to different constituencies. You're speaking to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They say environmental issues we don't understand. Go to the Ministry of Environment, and we talk about women's issues and human rights. And the Ministry of Environment actually says, like, that we don't deal with this issue, and they don't even really understand. So I cannot agree more actually about that we should speak in the language that the implementers can understand. So next I have Catherine Daspot-Belmont from UNEP WCMC. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well now. I'm really sorry that it seems that I wasn't loud enough on my previous.
This is much better, Catherine. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Building on the comment provided just now, I think a way to make those linkages between scientists in action groups, I think it was Tina that provided a very useful suggestion that we need to find ways to engage further at the local level with women's groups and make these commitments available somehow in the CBD process. So UNEP WCMC is currently working on the development of 2 platforms. One of them is supporting to further develop the Action Agenda platform to precisely showcase commitments. And I'm gonna talk to colleagues to make sure that we find a way to integrate these commitments and from women's organizations and working with women's organizations so that the ground level initiatives are reflected and integrated. And the other thing is that we're currently developing a platform, the Target Tracker. This platform hopefully will help to monitor progress, making use of data and indicators towards the targets of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the monitoring framework. So it'll be important to find a way also to visualize the commitments made, either if these are agreed in the gender plan of action or within the actual monitoring framework. It will be important to monitor progress towards gender-specific commitments and to ensure that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is indeed gender responsive. So our commitment from our organization will be to continue providing support on data and indicators and supporting the information flows post-2020, and we'll continue working with the Secretariat, providing our support. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, to share your the commitment and also like what your your specific work caring for the gender responsiveness in your work. And I have next Therese Arnenson from OCHR. Therese, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Soo-Young. Yes, my name is Therese Arnesen. I'm part of a small team in OCHR Geneva that works on climate change, environment, and human rights. And I just wanted to add to what everyone has said, and this comes out of yesterday's discussion that were very rich as well. That's something that came to mind when we were looking at the Gender Action Plan. That's gender and awareness raising. It's not just about, first of all, it's not just about speaking to the converted. And I feel like sometimes we're still, gender is a women's issue, or women's rights is a women's issue. So this whole point that a lot of colleagues have been making about breaking these silos and mainstreaming gender. I mean, this is what we do at the Human Rights Office on a daily basis. Human rights is part of one of the pillars of the UN system, but still we feel that we need to be in as many discussions as physically possible to make sure that human rights is actually mainstreamed throughout, even if that's actually the mandate of everyone working in the UN system. And back to the Gender Action Plan, an issue that I was thinking of when reviewing it was that when we speak of, I'm not saying placing the responsibility, but speaking of awareness raising and making rights holders aware of the rights they have, sometimes I feel like we're not addressing the real, sometimes very physical or legal obstacles to women's enjoyment of their human rights, including in relation to biodiversity and in relation to the environment. So, I mean, it's hard for me to say from Geneva headquarters how well aware women are of their own rights or not. But certainly, I would assume that women are very aware of the barriers that they encounter. Many of these are still legal or attitudinal stereotypes, traditional roles of women, etc. So I'm just trying to see how within that framework we can very practically address that. I just to speak of the work of the Human Rights Office, we try to, you know, a big part of our work is to ensure that legislation is not discriminatory and to assist governments and member states where it is to overcome those obstacles. So implementate, and then for this to be implemented, and that's a very real issue that we face is not necessarily that things are not in place on the paper, but that they're not implemented in practice. So I think I stopped here because I've talked too much, but we had such a rich discussion yesterday, and I'm looking forward to one more hour of discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, for sharing the inputs from and discussions from yesterday. And I'm sure it was very helpful to have an overview for everyone from yesterday's meeting. And after Teresa, I have Elena Monteroso from Center for International Forestry Research. Elena, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I just got logged off from my computer, so I hope that you can hear me well. I just wanted to build on some of the points that have already been shared by colleagues, and just building on some work that we have been doing around the multi-stakeholder platforms. And I just wanted to share, you know, I think the potential of multi-stakeholder platforms to support and keep us from working in silos and support coordination, and also to identify to some extent, you know, what are the enabling conditions and the barriers that women as individuals, but also as organizations are facing in terms of the information flows or capacities that needs to be enhanced, and also supporting the alignment at different scales. but also in terms of the synergies, you know, like we have these platforms going on in different spaces related to climate and biodiversity and forest issues. And, you know, the possibility of using these spaces to come up with context-tailored strategies that allow us to tackle some of the issues that we have been discussing so far. So thank you.
Thank you, Liana. And now next I have Veronica Coulantes from UN Women. Veronica, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you especially for this for this diagram. It's the one that's on our screen right now on the PowerPoint, and it's maybe I should just pick up on what was already mentioned. I think it was Therese who mentioned that we actually don't lack mandates and decisions and all that. And I would just mention that, for example, now there's the common approach on biodiversity, the UN system common approach on biodiversity that's being developed. And I think one of the, this is a leverage point, if you're asking about a leverage point, because it seems to be very comprehensive, but how do we tie up what's going on in all the work that we are already doing, like Indiana has mentioned. So I'm not sure if, I think the gap, the gender action plans should also feature in some document like this, which is a UN system-wide document. And you know, we cannot know everything, but at least with a platform like this, we get to hear a little bit of what's going on here and there. And the other point that I just want to mention is at the level of programming, right? Like how do we make sure that there are all these financial mechanisms, as we know, climate finance mechanisms that already have gender as one of their requirements, let's say, in making a project proposal, but also how to make sure that countries and even UN entities who can do so will submit a program, a project proposal or a program proposal that really is comprehensive enough to cover a wide range of environmental issues and also the gender dimensions that go beyond participation. You know, so how to meaning to address gender inequalities. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but just to appreciate this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, Verona, thanks so much for your helpful inputs again. And now, so we'll move on to the next question. So question number 4. And it's coming up on the screen. So question part number 4, moving forward, what should be the focus of interagency collaboration be to effectively protect women and girls' right to a healthy environment in line with the Secretary General's call to action for human rights? So I'll give you a few minutes to digest the question. And as usual, as per our practice, please type in your name in the chat box, please. Okay, very quiet for the moment. Anyone else or any questions on this part 4? And I think some UN colleagues here, they participate in the SG's call to action process. So please feel free to jump in and also introduce what you're doing there in terms of the promoting women and girls' right to healthy environment and how that can be also related to the SG's call to action on human rights. Ben from OHCHR needs 2 minutes. So we'll wait for him, but in the meantime, anyone else? Any feedback or any ideas on how to address this issue on interagency collaboration for protection of right to healthy environment of women and girls? I'll just briefly mention while we're waiting for Ben, I think he can also brief you on this process. But just in case not everybody is familiar with this call to action for human rights, there are 7 key areas in this the call to action, and the 5 is actually on the future rights of future generations and climate justice, and that actually talks about the right to health the environment, and that also includes everyone without discrimination, so like women and girls, but there's also another area that talks about gender equality and equality for women. So there are like 2 areas out of 7 that is relevant for this part 4. But I see, so I will move on to Georgina Katakura Vargas first, and then I'll give the floor to Ben after Georgina. Georgina, over to you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps in the discussion we have so far, we had mentioned some elements on what should be the focus. And one of those is to stop working in silos and also to overcome this international regulation complexity that sometimes is very unclear how the synergies are built or how the priorities should be set. So I am wondering, is more than a wonder, if something like promoting a platform between at least the 3 Rio conventions together with the UN Office on Human Rights will be something that could yield interesting discussions in something that and a previous speaker said on building these multi-stakeholder platforms, but in this case, it will be an interagency platform to move forward specifically on talking about biodiversity, climate change, land desertification, human rights, and women. And these very specific linkages that on the ground happened permanently. So just wondering how that would be, and that's for all. Thank you.
Okay, Georgina, very, very good question. So I'll give the floor to Benjamin Schotter from OHCHR, and I think he should be able to actually answer your question on the interagency platform. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Soo-Young, and for bearing with me a couple of minutes while I compose some thoughts. I think that Georgina's comments are really useful as well. It's always easier to speak second. And I would just say, in terms of our work, women's rights are human rights. So gender equality and the empowerment of women and women's rights are always going to be a part of what we do. And I think that there have been really interesting lessons learned from working in different intergovernmental spaces on gender equality, at least for me. But those experiences aren't fully formed in the sense that OHCHR, because of its limited capacity, we started out working on climate change, and I was lucky enough for Verona to have been one of the first people I talked to, and the women and gender constituency as well, and really getting a sense of how we can work on gender equality and women's rights in the UNFCCC space. We added additional work on biodiversity last year. We haven't really engaged very much with UNCCD, and we've only engaged as well to a limited extent with Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, Minamata, et cetera. You know, a lot of and the strategic approach to international chemical management. Now, just from being in the biodiversity space and the climate change space, I can see that there's a lot of potential from, you know, communication across those spaces, and of course with the Human Rights Council and you know, the work being done by the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms on environment and climate change. So how does that relate then to the Secretary General's call to action on human rights and work to advance the human right to a healthy environment? I mean, the first thing is we don't all have, according to most people, I could make an argument it's customary international law, but we don't all have the human right to a healthy environment, depending on where we live, right? So the first thing is we need universal recognition of the human right to a healthy environment in order to allow women and girls and everybody else to assert that right everywhere, no matter where they live. And we've already had great interagency collaboration around this in the context of both the Secretary General's call to action on human rights, which includes specific language on rights of future generations and climate justice, and the council where Soo-Young and UNEP led a collaborative effort to have 15 UN agencies call for universal recognition at the last session, right? So of the Human Rights Council. So that's an important piece, just getting the universal recognition so that everybody everywhere can assert the right, including, of course, women and girls. The more important piece, and my colleague Teresa mentioned this earlier, is sort of implementation. How do we actually ensure that in addition to recognizing these rights, we create systems of accountability for their realization? And there, I think we are doing some work on, in particular, protection of defenders, capacity building for national human rights institutions, and with respect to children and youth. And there's a gender focus in each of these spaces, right, under the Secretary General's call to action on human rights. But certainly important to continue the conversation and make sure that we're covering those issues well, and that we are really integrating in a meaningful way gender equality and the human rights of women and girls in that work. And sorry, I'm sure I went too long, but back to you, Soo-Young.
Thanks, Ben, for introducing all the work that we're doing under the SG's call to action for human rights, but also like OHCHR's work on gender and biodiversity. And so after Ben, I have Georgiana Katakura Vargas again. Georgiana, over to you.
Sorry, no, I think it was for my previous intervention.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I got confused with my note and the chat box. Sorry. So I have Minarelli from CB Alliance.
Hi, sorry, Soo-Young. I think most of the things have already been reflected by Georgina and by Ben. And I think I just wanted to also align the work. I think I didn't focus on the interagency collaboration because I think the amount of knowledge and work that all of you guys are doing is commendable. And I think it's I don't know, it's just maybe a way of seeing where that collaboration could be internally within the interagency group. And for me, I would really like to see how this interagency collaboration would bring about these challenges or recommendations to the international fora. Say, for example, if this interagency group also reflects women's and girls' right to a healthy environment and the SG's call on human rights to the global biodiversity framework and the other Rio conventions. So I think I would really like to see how this collaboration collectively could bring this focus on the GBF. And I think just also saying that it's also really very good to see the engagement together with the UN Women and also from the OHR office, where I think where Ben, you attended the second open-ended working group and also gave statements at the plenary session. So just like practical things of it really makes a difference, because in the agencies, all of you guys has a big say. And then the civil society groups, the women's caucus that we are, it also really helps us to then work together to strengthen this collaboration, to bring this important issue in the discussions.
Thank you very much for the very good feedback, Minarelli. And now I have Jillian Campbell. Jillian, over to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to what we talked about earlier in this session, which is on sort of national level coordination and collaboration. And I really do think that designing mechanisms for how we work together at the national level and trying to envision what that might look like should be one of the focuses for the collaboration. Because I think right now, I mean, as we've pointed out, there's different MEAs, there's different agencies that are all doing national work, that are all helping develop plans. And many of these plans don't interact with each other and don't involve the same stakeholders. And so I think that if we could try to design mechanisms that help improve collaboration at the national level, then this would be something that's really worth doing. So that's it. Thanks.
Jillian, thanks so much for the input and the reaction, because that's actually something that we've been discussing a lot under the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, because the whole purpose of this call to action is implementation on the ground. So what we are doing, like developing guidance on environmental human rights offenders and also the right to health environment, we're really targeting the RC's office so that can be implemented. So it's not as easy as it sounds, because all countries, they have different circumstances, they have different priorities, but that's what we are really aiming to do, the ground level implementation. Yeah. So let me just check the chat box. I don't see anyone signed up. Is there anyone else? We still have a few more minutes on part 4. So please feel free to jump in or come in. Okay, Flora Newman from UNEP. Flora, over to you.
Thank you. And just on the point about interagency collaboration, we, as a secretariat to a treaty body, it's really important for our interagency collaboration that it goes beyond the secretariats to also include implementing agencies, because what we're talking about here is implementation. And we do have some informal networks and some formal networks that we use and potentially could leverage for the purpose of this call to action that already exists. So, you know, we're already, the 3 Rio conventions, the focal points for those conventions meet, and we also have we're expanding that out to the focal points of other environmental treaties. And I think one of the things we all need to recognize is our limitation in terms of capacity to engage in these things. So we need to be utilizing the infrastructure that we already have. I think to be able to actually stretch our capacities across and time across the different spaces. So it could perhaps be a focus of one of those existing groups as well. Just a thought.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective from the MEA Secretariat floor. And anyone else wanting to take the floor? I'll give 1 more minute. If not, we may just move on to the next part. Okay, so if I don't have anyone who wants to take the floor, so shall we move to the next part? And now it's concluding Q&A, so you can just jump in and ask any questions or answer and have a free discussion. So I will open the floor for the Q&A. So it will be the same. Please type in your name, sign up your name, sign up in the chat box. You don't have to be bound by these 4 questions, and anything related to gender responsiveness and biodiversity and the rights issues, please feel free to come in.
I just wanted to jump in to say, I'm just thinking about some of the comments that are made, that were just made in regards to interagency collaboration. And I was thinking we have Gabriella on the call, who is leading the Jeff Gender Partnership. And I'm just, I was thinking of that as a group that brings together Jeff implementing agencies, as well as the different conventions that are financed under the Jeff. So I don't know, Gabriella, if you wanted even just to speak a little bit to the focus of that group and any potential that you see as relevant and supporting some of the things that have come out of this discussion so far. Thanks.
Gabrielle, would you like to come in?
Oh, I think actually maybe she's left the conversation. I saw she was here earlier, but I'm not seeing her name in the list right now. So
okay, I was just looking. Okay, so if she comes back, we'll ask if she wants to come in. Okay, thank you, Tanya. And now I see Verona Colantis from UN Women. Verona, over to you.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much. This is a very efficient discussion, and I think the points keep repeating themselves. So I think it's we're looking forward to the recommendation or summary of the discussions. But just as a question, because I see that Ileana and I think Marcus at some point I saw was here. I just was wondering, because I know that you were preparing a paper on the synergies, like a kind of a synergies paper relating to ecosystems management. If you have an update on that, I think this will feed also into our discussion here. And then a second question, and I don't know, maybe it's the EMG can respond regarding this document, the UN System Common Approach on Biodiversity, because I know that this is being discussed at the level of HLCP now, and I was just wondering if you will have a role in sort of oversee, I don't know if overseeing is the right word, but in terms of seeing through the implementation and to what extent then maybe this group here can make sure that the gender responsive implementation is part of that. Yeah, so I leave it there. Thank you.
So I will probably toss this question to either Tanya or Nina. So let me actually take one more question. I missed it. I'm so sorry that Minarli had a question. How can these rich discussions that have taken place over the 2 days provide inputs to the GPA that is being proposed? Would anyone like to take this question?
I can speak to that, and I'm happy for other inputs as well. Just to say that as much as I think I mentioned at the beginning that there has been a recent consultation that just closed on the updated version of the draft outline, but that next draft is in preparation right now to be made available for the formal meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation under the CBD. So, these discussions are timely, and they were intended to kind of support some of the thinking in developing this next gender plan. So I think it's certainly useful for me to hear what people's thoughts and ideas are and how to inform that. But I think it sort of goes beyond what is in the plan to really, the questions are a lot around national implementation. And so for me, that's the next step, is like having a plan that is ambitious and well structured and clear with measurable actions is the goal right now, is the objective. But we really need to engage on how that can be implemented well. And I think that some of that's coming out in this conversation as to the sort of collaboration that's needed at the interagency level, but also very much at the national level. And what can be done in our various organizations to support that, or what are other things that we can point to and try and raise attention on in terms of maybe opportunities to strengthen national level implementation. So any comments or thoughts regarding that are welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, Tanya. And I see Barbara DeLosa joined from the U.S. Department of State. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, colleagues. I've been sitting here absorbing a lot of what you've been saying, and one of the things that occurred to me is the CBD has really been a leader in terms of trying to mainstream biodiversity across other sectors, and that's been really interesting. And I would certainly agree with the previous speakers that the national level is where this really comes together and becomes real for countries, and also where I think you get the most efficiencies. But when I think about the areas CBD has looked at mainstreaming into, and then I look at the gender action plan, there seems to kind of be a disconnect in some ways about, like, are these the right areas for like dealing with land tenure and political engagement and that sort of thing that we need to get to tackle some of these really hard to break through areas. And are there examples from other conventions or other fora where they've been able to kind of crack this nut a bit? It just seems so insurmountable. And yet if we can't get at that, like, how do we keep moving forward? Because it almost seems like you've got, as folks have said, there's different silos at the national level, and even certainly in our government where we have a lot of interagency collaboration, people come from different frames of reference and have different understandings. And so for like finance-oriented colleagues, like, unless we can help them understand the importance of biodiversity and the importance of women's engagement in various aspects of it, how do we get good projects or programs or whatever that have all these different constituencies in mind? Are there examples at national levels or even sub-regional of sort of cross-sectoral trainings or different things where we can draw the threads together? I'm just curious if others are aware of things that we can learn from out there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And I see that Nina posted a few questions from yesterday's discussion. So please have a look at it. And also you can answer these questions. I share your input for these questions. And I see Marlene Elias. So Marlene can answer Verona's question. So Marlene, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I think, thanks for bringing up this paper, Verona. Basically, we've been working with Marcus and Ileana and other colleagues on a paper that looks at land-based approaches for advancing advance multiple goals, environmental goals of the Rio Conventions, as well as gender equality synergistically. And the idea is to really produce some very concrete examples that can help some of the program and project developers wrap their minds around how we can have practical strategies to advance these multiple goals. And I think that speaks also a little bit to what the Barbara was just mentioning. What does that look like to have, you know, these programs or these projects that can advance health, nutrition, economic, and other goals at the same time? So we've got a draft of the paper. There are certainly many more examples that could be raised in that regard, but I do think some very concrete guidance is very useful for project developers. We get something similar in our own organizations where there's the will, but there's not really a clear sense of how to do it. And that was a little bit what I was thinking too, in terms of, you know, interagency collaboration, but also just how to coordinate across the conventions and so on with these kinds of lessons and examples. And I was wondering if there was some kind of perhaps a resource hub or a place where people could go to learn from successful examples of other countries and from other conventions. So it might, you know, a lot of the approaches that we're looking at could have been used to advance any of the 3 Rio conventions. So I think some kind of common repository or place to draw on these kinds of examples would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marlene. And everyone, this is an open Q&A session. So if you want to answer any of the colleagues' questions, please also feel free to jump in. And now I see Verona Colantis from UNEP. Verona, over to you.
Yeah. Hi, just a quick response to what Barbara mentioned earlier about experiences on collaborative work. I remember UN Women organizing capacity building workshop for focal points, national focal points of UNFCCC and CBD on something that we worked on with the, sorry, not CBD, UNCCD. So we worked on with the UNCCD Secretariat. So we put together focal points of these 2 conventions and on something about gender mainstreaming in specific areas of their work. And that was really, I think that's something that we should do more, because these people, they see each other for the first time. I mean, they know each other because they're from the same governments, but then they don't necessarily work with each other, and especially on gender issues. And when we came to talk about the gender mainstreaming, it's kind of, why haven't we learned about this before? We should have integrated gender in our target setting for our LDN, but we didn't know how to do it. And the same with, and in our NDCs. So you know, so I think just as a question of what should we be doing more, I think these are the kinds of things that we should be doing more. And I know that it's challenging, but it's well worth it, and I think there's more gain from the perspective of advancing gender issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verona. And now I have Natalie Awell from WRI. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think just to support what's been said and what Verona just said, and drawing from our experiences with the NDCs, the partnership has this mechanism, and I think in some countries it's used to a greater degree than in other countries. And so they have these coordinators for the NDC that are part of the NDC partnership, and they also have gender focal points. And this coordination mechanism, sometimes they're one and the same, but some of them I'm finding with the countries that we're working with, they have, they've really brought all the ministries together. So for example, in Marshall Islands, they have regular coordinating meetings with all of the partners, and they've been bringing them together for our work. and helping us to engage with all of them. But then they asked us to give a training that would help them to implement the recommendations that we're making based on our assessment. And so we've got all of these representatives from all the different ministries that are associated in the room for these trainings. I mean, they're in rooms, we're online. And so we're kind of bringing them all together around common terminology and the approaches that we're talking about to get at gender and human rights within their NDC, but that's broadly because the implementing mechanism is all of the different ministries. And so all of the people that would be engaged in implementing the commitments under the NDC are getting that common understanding of the terminology, the concepts that we're talking about, and the approaches. And we're finding that they're starting to coordinate, because the way we're set up is that there's a lot of interaction across the different ministries. And so we're yet to see the results of that, but we are seeing a lot more support and engagement around the assessment that we've done and discussion about how they're going to implement the recommendations, which aren't even finalized yet. So that might be one model to look at. I think even within the NDC, there could be a lot of rollout around other countries, like pulling from certain countries that really have strong coordination mechanisms and seeing how that can be applied to other countries. So that might be one place to look for examples. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Natalie. And I see Flora Newman from UNEP. Flora, over to you.
Thanks. And just on Natalie's last point, I think it is one of the things that we see is that those countries that have put in place coordination mechanisms that allow for the removal of silos also within government, that's where we see also a stronger linkage with work on gender. One of the things under the UNFCCC is that there is an invitation to countries, parties to nominate national gender and climate change focal points. Not all countries have, but for those countries that have, it provides us with another entry point and and the Secretariat has a mandate to facilitate capacity and support to those focal points, and part of their role, depending on the role, is not defined in great detail, and it's one of the things that is under discussion under the Gender Action Plan, but depending on which country, their role may involve advocating and supporting the mainstreaming of gender in national climate policies. So part of what the skills that are needed there is around functional skills of advocacy and being able to communicate in a way that is understood by those in finance or in transport or in whichever, but also then in relation to sort of specific understanding of gender in the context of those things as well. What it allows us to do is to have a very willing cohort of country contacts who are then able to sort of build those networks with other countries. And then what we see is the potential for us to, as Verona had mentioned about the national focal points, is the need for us to then help create those spaces where the national gender and climate change focal points and the national focal points come together. So it is another lesson learned, I guess, from the UNFCCC process that with support, so support from within country, but also the support that we are able to provide, that can be a very useful mechanism for building the in-country support.
Thank you, Flora. But I have actually one very specific question to you from Verona. So she asked you, is it possible to have one gender focal point for the 3 Rio conventions?
I think you would need to ask a national gender and climate change focal point that, because it's the same issue that we have with focal points for the conventions themselves. It's generally speaking not their only job, and so yes, I think there is benefit in them understanding the linkages between these things, but it may be too much for one person to be the focal point for all of those areas, particularly if it's not their underlying core function doesn't relate perhaps to one of those things, but it's certainly one of the reasons why we see some countries nominate more than one focal point, because it is too much for one person to be necessarily undertaking that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we would need to talk to the focal points about that.
Thank you, Flor. So I see some feedback and questions on the chat box. So there were some feedback, and having a repository sounds good. And also, let me see, sorry, I'm just reading through the list. And how we can integrate this submission process for gender and data and policy, because they're very often divided up. And can we have one, another one on the what parties can have done to address gender and climate, biodiversity, etc. So basically, whether we can have an integrated approach to environmental MEAs, I think, and also the different gender and policy and data issues in one. Any reaction to this, or any other questions or any other feedback and comments?
I was just going to jump in, Soo-Young, just to respond to some of the comments that have come up in the last part of the discussion. One of the things that we've done under the CBD recently is put together a compilation of best practices on gender and biodiversity that include a series of case studies and smaller examples around what's, you know, what are some good things that we want to promote. And so this document is going to be ready in the next couple of months. It's just getting designed right now. But out of that, one of the examples that we included was from Uganda, who is actually developing, I think it's, they're developing a national gender action plan for, I think it's for environment. I don't know that it's for biodiversity specifically, but they, they've sort of taken on board some of the discussions and the work under the CBD process to influence this. And I think they've also been engaging with other convention focal points. I know that Malawi has also established kind of a working group with the national gender focal points from the different Rio conventions. So there are some practices kind of at the national level that are trying to support a more coordinated approach. One of the key messages that we put forward in this publication is about scaling up small scale initiatives. But part of that is the need for kind of mapping and awareness of what is actually happening, to, you know, what is good that needs to be scaled up. And I think that's part of our, you know, our challenge here is that we don't always know what the good examples are and where they're happening and how they can be replicated. So I'm just mentioning that because I think it responds a bit to some of the kind of interest raised around strengthening action at the national level, is also trying to, you know, find ways of sharing what work is happening and how that can be promoted. Okay, I just see a comment. Can these examples from Uganda be proposed as actions in the GPA? Perhaps, yeah, I'm not, I have to see if they might fit in. I think you know, in terms of what's been proposed so far for the gender plan of action, I haven't wanted to say that countries should develop their own gender plans of action. I think that's very much up to at the national level to determine that. But this is meant to give them a structure and a focus so that if they think it's suitable and necessary to have a national level gender plan of action, it could be used as a basis for that. Yeah, okay, I'm also just seeing in the chat that Tina has mentioned the Friends of Gender Equality group that's led by Canada and Malawi. And definitely we invite others to participate in that discussion where we try and share some things that are happening under the convention and just also try and get inputs regarding things like the gender plan of action and related decisions and for discussion under the CBD. So that was my immediate comments here.
Okay, thank you so much, Tanya. Actually, this kind of smoothly leads into your summary of discussion and next steps. So, would you like to give a few words on? You actually gave a very good summary and reaction to this discussion, but also a few words more on the next steps and anything else that you would like to share with the colleagues. Over to you, Tanya.
No, thanks very much, and thanks everyone for participating in this discussion today. I think I find it very useful just to have the opportunity to engage with all of you who are involved in this line of work and to get some different perspectives, which is really helpful, because I think part of the challenge from my perspective is being somewhat isolated in the Secretariat, where we aren't necessarily as in contact with what's happening elsewhere, including under UNEP all of the time. So it's good to kind of have a forum to come together. So it's one of the things that has come to my mind as like maybe the practical action. I know everybody is always too busy, and nobody wants to have more meetings, but sometimes it is useful to have some set opportunities for discussion. So I just wanted to recap a little bit, or maybe come back to some of the key points that I thought stood out in the discussion so far. I think there's a lot of consensus on the whole challenges around standalone policies and processes at the national level, and the need for more alignment. So how do we do that? How do we foster that? Action at the regional level, I think, is very interesting. Annette, I saw your comment in the chat about regional platforms and creating a roadmap for implementation at the regional and sub-regional level. We've tried to work on some of that in the Southeast Asia region, which I think provides a bit of an example for what can be done elsewhere. But one of the reasons that I won't go into that work too much, but just to say, I do think working at the regional level can provide a bit of a bridge between global level policy objectives and national level implementation, where if you have regional level organizations with sufficient capacity who can serve as a coordination hub to support implementation among national level countries, that can be a way of trying to mitigate some of this divide that we see between very high level policy approaches and challenges to implement them on the ground. I know there was some mention or proposal for a cross-convention liaison group from Verona around the Rio Conventions. I think that ties in well with something that was proposed later on, I think by Marlene, about a resource hub to provide more concrete examples and give an opportunity or a location for people to go to look for such examples. I think that sounds great. I think again, it's the question of who would do that, or how would that be managed. So I don't have an answer for that part of it, but I think the idea has some potential. I think in regards to the discussion around COVID-19 and what needs to be done, what came out to me as part of that is, in looking at this, the really adverse impacts that have affected women in particular from this pandemic, it does make the case for the need for stronger investment in gender responsive approaches. So maybe that's the argument that we can take forward in promoting further initiatives in this coming decade. And I was really interested to hear more about or find opportunities to learn from WRI's approach that you mentioned, Natalie, in that fostering that enabling environment to bring about empowerment. So getting people in the institution to understand really how to articulate things, what they mean, and how to support empowerment at at a more meaningful level. So it sounds like you are making some progress in that. And I think if there's some opportunity to learn more about the work that you are doing at the institutional level, I think that would be personally very valuable. And what else? I'm sure I'm missing some important comments. But yeah, I think we're all kind of searching for ways that we can support and help ensure better national level coordination and collaboration. And I think as Fleur mentioned as well, using the infrastructure that we already have to do that is one opportunity. So trying to just kind of build the connections where we can, and you know, raising people's awareness around the different and related approaches that are happening, the different plans of action under the 3 Rio conventions, for example. And I think that's one of the reasons that I included in the draft outline for the gender plan the relationship or the coherence with the other international commitments that are related to gender and biodiversity, as a way of kind of building the rationale for similar actions under the CBD, but also to try and kind of find ways to link up the work that's already been done under these areas to strengthen that under the CBD process and contribute to better outcomes overall. So it's kind of part of the messaging, and I guess intended to support collaboration in that regard. So maybe I will leave it here. I know we're coming close to the end of our scheduled time, but I thank you very much all again for your participation and your interest in this work. And I hope we can continue the conversation. And I know Nina has a few last words, so don't leave just yet. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So on behalf of the EMG, thank you all very much for your valued remarks on the intersectionality between gender and biodiversity, having such concrete remarks on gender responsive action, especially on the GPA. So it's true that gender mainstreaming is such a nuanced effort, so we really, truly require interagency collaboration. More importantly, actual next step, as Tanya so eloquently volunteered, by the agencies as well as the stakeholders. So one key takeaway from me is that the importance of disaggregated data, monitoring, review, evaluation, follow-up. So science policy interface follows this sequence. In order to have review, evaluate, and follow up on progress, we must identify understandable, valid, localized indicators, which effectively monitor and register our women and girls and engage their presence. So with this being said, the recorded playback as well as the outcome document will be uploaded on the EMG landing page for the series. In particular, we will be reaching out to you to provide feedback to ensure we have reflected your interventions responsibly. And for now, I wish you, our wonderful roundtable participants, a productive rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.